Every time when we work on a project, we try to do something new and exciting. One of the reasons why we choose Adobe products is that it gives us more flexibility in what we're trying to achieve.
As a feature editor, you always want things to be changing and improving. We want to be comfortable with the tools with which we work.
What we need in an editing package is really an uninterrupted flow between the idea and the output. And so Premiere seemed like the perfect choice for us.
I feel like I'm able to work faster. I'm able to get an idea out of my brain faster with Premiere. We just love the program, and I feel like the show is better because of it.
As cutting becomes more involved with visual effects, that's become increasingly important that you have platforms like this helping you sort of see the film as you go along.
The way I edit is conducive to using Adobe Premiere. The way I can move in Premiere is the way that I would see things playing out on my head.
Premiere is simple to navigate, but it offers so much complexity.
These are the kinds of tools that we need to go beyond metaphor, go beyond simile.
In After Effects, there were particularly functions that blew my mind. They were so important to our workflow.
Premiere Pro allowed us to just concentrate on telling the story and less about importing and doing all these other things that slow down the process and would have really hindered our creative ability.
For me, editing is 50% of direction, because I'm recreating it in post and I'm rewriting it in post.
I think that it's an extreme golden time. The editing system doesn't get in your way and allows you to facilitate the vision that you think in your head that you would like to be able to do, and the system says, yeah, I can do that.
Hello, I'm Ian Haydn Smith, and I'd like to welcome you to this special visual effects BAFTA film session supported by Adobe Premiere Pro. It's part of a virtual series that celebrates the work of nominees of this year's British Academy Film Awards. And before we begin, a few housekeeping notices. If you want to join the conversation on social, please use hashtag #EEBAFTAs. If you have a question that you want to ask towards the end of a session, you've got a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use that and send in a question to us. And also available in that bar at the bottom of the screen is closed captioning, which you can turn on by pressing the CC button. Joining us tonight, we have members of the teams from the nominated films Greyhound, The Midnight Sky, Mulan, The One and Only Ivan, and Tenet. And as you're going to see over the course of the next hour, we have a huge number of stars from the special visual effects firmament. And we're going to start with Greyhound, and I'd like to welcome visual effects supervisors Nathan McGuinness and Pete Bebb, who are nominated alongside Sebastian von Overheid. Hello, both.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So looking at Greyhound, one of the first things that struck me in the telling of the story of these treacherous transatlantic crossings during the Second World War is the level of verisimilitude, the attention to the actual details of these ships and submarines that fought in these battles. Could you talk about the challenges of adhering to all these period details?
Yeah. Research. We did a lot of research. I mean, the movie originally was structured a lot with Tom dialogue, his world, and where we had to come into play was expanding upon that with the world around Tom, which is the character, the sea, and the only way we really could grasp that world was to go back in time and to research as much historical footage as possible, and that meaning everything from the sheer treachery of what was happening at that time with all the crossings, the wolf packs and just how devastating that was. There was a lot of footage that was available, and also a lot of documentation, and also some very interesting recordings from reporters and just people in that moment at sea. So the only way Pete and I could get into the moment is to actually try to transport ourselves back into that era. So, you know, we never used references of anything to do with today's filmmaking. We really always respected what was there then, and that was the core essence of how we really zoned in on the particular parts of the movie, and, you know, placing ourselves on the deck, placing ourselves in the subs, placing ourselves in the feeling of just how awful it was. That's how we went about it. And we also really focused on obviously not having the ability to normally go and get all these ocean plates and try to, and the preparation that we would normally have. We had to think like we were a camera crew. We had to think like what it would be like if we were shooting off a Zodiac with a handheld, with a lever. You know, we had to really kind of put ourselves in all those positions so we could have a line of dialogue that made sense to the visual effects teams. So it was more visceral and real. And so that was our approach. A lot of research and planning. And Pete Bebb will say this, very military driven, to get 1,400, 1,500 shots done in 4 months.
And just on that, perhaps I can bring Pete in here, but on this idea of the military precision, this is a film in which the audience is very, very aware of every single minute of the day that we're in, because there are shifts. And as such, we have to be convinced that the time of day we're watching is absolutely right in terms of the light, the sun in the sky, or the weather, everything. It's quite remarkable. I just wonder the number of charts that you will have had to actually work out what was going on when, what time of day, how the day would look.
What we did, I came into it, looked at the edit, and built a cheat sheet, a timeline from the beginning of the show to the end, because it all happened over a period of 3 days, 2.5 days. And Pete went out with a system from DNEG and did time-lapse, 24-hour time-lapse, and Pete will go into that. So we could basically just collect basically like a HDRI, but Pete went and did all of this on the oceans in the UK, bad weather, and we were able to put all the lighting situations right where the moments of the movie are in the script, lined up, spot on, sitting in a dark room, picking those moments. That then told us the setup, and that was, again, the military-driven style that we did. We obviously went very absolutely related to every moment at time, because the ships were zigzagging the whole way through the Atlantic. So, you know, where the sun was, the horizon and the direction, we had a road. We basically built a roadmap from an aerial view, so we could watch all the way through the movie exactly where the boats were, the ships were, the convoy, the U-boats. So we always could look down and see where everything was. If we didn't have that, it would have just been a shambles. We would have been lost everywhere. So that was, if we didn't have our roadmap, our time of day lighting setups, our assets, our attention to detail, unfortunately, not enough time. We could have done so much better, but we were basically doing speed visual effects. We were previewing, building assets, we're doing everything at once in 4 months. So that's our story. And all it did for us was it did show hope. It showed hope that we could actually build films and make stories at sea. And we could probably now do it better. You know, it was a very interesting event for Pete and I, because we were very alone. It was Pete and I just trying to conquer a monster, and it, you know, the type of monster nobody wants to attack. The minute people say you want to do a job all at water, everyone just runs. You know, so we didn't run. We just went head on, and that's how we did it. So it was.
Sorry. I was going to say part of that monster that you mentioned is the sea itself. I gather that you had a list of a variety of sea conditions to choose from. But one of the things that really got me, the sort of devil in the detail, is there's one moment where CG water splashes across the camera, and suddenly we have this obscured image, which I thought was extraordinary.
That was you know, that was the idea of the level of detail moments. You know, if you were at sea moments, you know, we had to go to that level where, you know, that would happen. You know, you're never going to have a dry lens when you're shooting in a Beaufort scale. You know, we were trying to be a camera crew at sea. Obviously, nowhere near as difficult as what it would be if you were shooting at sea in that scale. But Pete and I made it quite simple. We had one shot of it was a Beaufort 8, which is you know, we went via the Beaufort scale. It was quite a bit, and it was a very nice piece of ocean footage. And we just really looked at that and said, let's do that. That was the shot. So we didn't indate people with hundreds of references of what oceans would look like, you know, because we wanted to organically build an ocean that works properly and not just a push button simulated ocean effect. You know, we really needed to get the realism. So we tried to simplify by just zoning in on particular clips instead of hundreds of clips. So to everything from the water hitting the lens and the style and the camera movement and all the imperfections, we're trying to add all that, and it pays off. You know, even at night, you know, in theory, the night you saw a lot more at night, but you know, Pete and I know that we would have seen a lot less, but you know, for cinematic reasons, we had to bring up the levels more. So that's kind of the level that we're trying to do. We're just trying to move the show along and keep adding the layers of reality at sea as we kept moving. It was always trying to go. We never went backwards. We always kept going forward. We had no backwards.
And from your perspective, Pete, you've got this incredibly concentrated 4-month period. What did you find the greatest challenge that you had to face?
I think the biggest thing for me was the level of complexity and the fact of the logistics of the situation. So it was getting people into the mindset and getting them up and running to this. So we did have a challenge of the fact that we were doing, the majority of the shots was you know, full CG ocean. And as Nathan said, the ocean was a character that had not been developed by the time that we'd actually joined. So we had to then, knowing full well that the ocean is all derived by the weather, which is why I sent off, you know, a crew off to the four corners of the UK. Thankfully, it was the middle of the British winter, which was ideal for the North Atlantic conditions. And that was, you know, we got the weather, the dramatic type of weather that we required for the show. And we did shoot, you know, 10 camera array over multiple stops in order to try to get that kind of time-lapse feel. And then we presented this and it lit the oceans. And this is what we presented to Nathan, so they could pick off those time slice moments per scene, per sequence, that we could actually say, that is it. And that was great for us because that meant that we could actually promote certain shots or types of shot forward in order to try to get a sign off on the look, a bit like a kind of sequence lock or, you know, sequence grade. And that allowed us to actually have shots to aim for. And you know, we're always referencing, as Nathan said, we had a huge depository of Pathé footage that we only looked at that because that was the stuff that was most relevant to us. And in order to try to be in keeping with authenticity and respect to the subject matter, and we always used to reference that. So that was what we do as side-by-side clips for matching for the depth charges or the tracer fire, which was an odd kind of thing to do, but we felt that was the correct way to try to achieve the look that we wanted. And it was correct. did want to try to get that kind of authenticity into our work. And I hope that actually shows across the board with that, because we do have quite a visceral and guttural feel to things, almost to the point where the water on the lens, for example, for the binoculars that Tom uses throughout the shots, they get increasingly more built up with salt water on the lens. You know, you just have that little level. It's a very subtle nuance of detail, but it does actually make a difference. You'll notice that they start a little bit cleaner at the start and get dirtier throughout to the end of the film, and as they would. You know, we were looking at actual World War II binoculars. We measured them, we photoed them, and that's what we use. So I think that when we address a film like this, certainly a Tom Hanks war film, I mean, what a fantastic, you know, challenge that would be. And I think that for me, that was the biggest thing. It was getting the team enthused. You know, we all went down to the HMS Belfast so we could see what a destroyer would look like up front. We all learned Morse code just for the hell of it. And that is it. It's getting into the kind of mindset to do a film like this, so you actually enjoy it and you actually create good work. And I think that we did.
And you talk about the binoculars. What's really interesting is I've seen some war films, and you see these ships in battle. They've probably been out for 2 or 3 years, and yet they are pristine and new looking. And the first time you see a really great look at one of the submarines, it's looking pretty crappy.
Yes. Yes. that was the aim.
we were trying to go for the authentic feel, and also the kind of terrifying, ugly world that it was. You know, you were trying to portray that, and you know, we were lucky in a way that, you know, we were housed in at Playtone, Tom's office. So it was kind of nice. He'd walk across into the room and just sit with us. And, you know, obviously because it was a adapted screenplay by Tom, he would sit and kind of explain too how he felt and his research. And so, you know, we really went about this, and the way our dialogue between Pete and I was very about the personal feeling of what it must have been like. And that drove our visual effects. And, you know, so we were trying to be storytellers as well as technicians, as well as visual effects specialists, as well as historians, as well as, you know, we're trying to wear all these hats. And we didn't have a lot of communication with the outside world, because we had to keep it really tight between Pete and I, because we had no option. You know, we had too much to do in too little time, and we wanted to go so much further, but you know, we had to let go. We had to let go, and we had to keep moving on. And we did get excited. We got excited once we started to see, you know, some of the key shots really start to work. You know, once we started to see the Greyhound starting to plow through those oceans, and we were starting to see everything come to life, we started to get excited and going, yeah, we're onto something right now. Wish we had another year, you know, but wish we could have thought about this. But the only preemptive strike we had was, you know, really putting together a very detailed library of research elements, you know, from everything, from the guns, from the subs, from the damage, from the textures. We didn't have assets either. So Pete and Pete's team are out there they're building assets, you know, while we're dropping shots in. So, you know, everything was more about, and Pete will say this, what the camera saw was all we focused on. You know, and unfortunately the other side would have been nothing, you know, because we didn't have the time to do that. You know, it's like, yes, oh, what, you want to go around the other side of the ship? No, sorry, there probably isn't any of it. You know, we really had to focus on what the camera saw because of the situation we were in.
That's great. Thanks, Pete and Nathan. And we'll come back to you shortly with the audience questions once we've had a round with everyone. Next, I'd like to welcome the nominees for The Midnight Sky. Visual effects supervisors Matt Kasmir and Chris Lawrence, special effects supervisor David Watkins, and visual effects animation supervisor Max Solomon. Hello all.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So I want to start. Recently, I watched again the 1948 drama Scott the Antarctic. and then returned to, when I found out about this event, to watch The Midnight Sky again. And it's extraordinary to see how far we've come in recreating some of the most inhospitable places on the planet. Obviously, this is a film of two parts, terra firma and Outer Space, but I want to start with the recreation of the Arctic. Could you talk about the challenges of creating this extraordinary world?
Oh, well, I mean, I'll start with that. I mean, absolutely. I had an absolute terror of shooting the Arctic on stage, and it was the kind of worst case scenario, because we did shoot a lot in Iceland, and that established a look. But unfortunately, we then had to intercut. We didn't have enough time in Iceland to shoot, so we had to intercut with stage. And the thing about snow and ice is it refracts so much light, it refracts so much environment, and it's all subliminal. It's like the human eye. You know when a human eye is wrong, and we know when snow's wrong. And so kind of we employed this Roscoe screen with sky panels behind to basically marry up the skies that we'd shot on location, so we could get the variation of light. Because, you know, Dave did this amazing job with all of this practical snow, but without the light physically falling on it, it was useless. I mean, you know, we've all been there on stage when I've had real snow and ice, and yet it still looks dead under a flat roof. So David created this amazing environment for not just, you know, for the Arctic tundra, but for also the pod sinking.
There's an incredible amount of wind as well, wasn't there, Dave?
Oh, wind, and yeah, and also it's like the snow wasn't falling snow. We didn't see a single bit of falling snow the whole time we were shooting. And yet, you know, we somehow kind of, with this adversity, kind of created this environment where it felt believable. And that's kind of like what leads into kind of later aspects and our stagecraft and Anima. Was we wanted everybody to be involved with our process. And, you know, and Chris and I were absolutely kind of, you know, that was our one kind of paramount conviction, and that was
we did an awful lot of research with snow business, and there was a lot of to and fro with George and Grant coming to view different show and tells with different looks. It wasn't something like we laid it down and that's what we went with. It was quite a drawn out 2 or 3 week period where they came and had a look at different show and tells that we'd laid out for them, and they tweaked it as we went along to eventually go to a process of hot paraffin wax is what we laced all the sets with. But no, it worked really well, and like Chris says, there's a lot of high pressure wind in there that we created for that sequence. But the guys took it over and did a fantastic job, you know.
The pod sequence was mentioned. Could you talk a little bit about that, David? Because it's something that's both at once familiar in certain ways, and yet I felt there was something fresh about seeing this scene of these people and this world they're sleeping in slowly sinking into the water.
Well, I think the main part of the sequence for me is George, is the end part of it, and George literally seeing his life going away because the life support, his life support is sinking, and he knows he can't reach it. And that moment for me is very poignant, but a great challenge from a physical point of view. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to put the background up, to just show the complexity of the stage and all the rigs that were integral to that big ice shelf. It was that was one of the biggest challenges for us, was coordinating all of those different hydraulic features together, all working at the same time, you know, and then taken over by the guys.
Max, if I can bring you in, what were the challenges for you?
Animation wise, there was the CG digital humans, which I don't think we'd done anything quite so sort of full frame and photo real. Also, as Matt was saying earlier, intercut with live action. So in some shots we had the real actors, and then we were cutting to digital humans. Well, the same actor but digital. That was the most scary thing.
And just in terms of looking at one of the key moments in space, the spacewalk, and then the collision sequence. Could you all talk a little bit about the balance between wire work with the actors and mapping the actors' faces onto CG characters? Because I've seen the SFX showreel, and it is incredibly complex.
Shall I go there, Matt? I think
yeah, and you start.
Basically, we sort of went into it thinking we would do a lot of wire work, and when we realised how good the digital faces were looking, we became emboldened to use digital doubles more. And I think to really good effect with the shoot, we really were sort of using live action characters for anything sort of like a cowboy shot or closer, which was relatively, they were a bit easier to shoot from a stunts point of view. The constraints on production became a bit more straightforward, and you could shoot more quickly. And then anything wider, where there was a lot more travel. And in any case, you can't shoot in 0G unless you go in the vomit comet. So you don't get a realistic dynamic, and that's where Max's work was going to come in anyway. So it seemed to make sense to just go fully digital. And Jenny was a great collaborator with the costumes, and we got these very, very photorealistic looking costumes, and that was a really good collaborative process, again, where we drew her into what we were doing, and we didn't try and necessarily take over. It was more about enabling her vision to be realized through our craft, really. So yeah, it was a lot more, we were a lot more bold with using full digital doubles than I've done in the past, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to kind of add on that there was kind of one film before ours that really worked the way it did, and it was Gravity. And unfortunately, our director had starred in that film, and Chris, you'd worked on it, and so had Max. And so we kind of had this dilemma, you know, we had to improve. And George also knew how long it took to shoot all of the various complex pieces to cut into this film, and he wanted to improve on this, and this is testament to him and the producers, was they left it up to us to kind of work out how, and that was a combination of previs, meticulous planning, and the anima system, and the fact that, you know, very early on we had faith in this system from ILM and their transparency with Framestore and Chris, and it was working. It was a revelation. I mean, to me, the holy grail of visual effects has always been a digidouble that holds up. And there's about 70 odd shots in this film where I forget they're digidoubles, and to me that is testament.
One of the sequences I want to talk about, and if anyone has not yet watched the film, you might want to turn the sound off for a moment. Tiffany Boone's Maya caught in the airlock. I think a couple of times every year you have one of those jaw-dropping moments where it's just something that's quite extraordinary to look at, and this is one of them. Could you all talk about this sequence? And apparently George Clooney referred to it as the Ballet of Blood.
Yeah, so again, I'm just going to set the scene. It was written in the script that Maya tears her spacesuit on a piece of metal. And again, this had been seen in a film that he'd starred in, and he didn't want to do that. And we'd just been looking at a reference of liquids in space. And he said to me, what about, you know, she bleeds to death in Zero Gravity and it's a ballet. And I was, you know, and I walked away thinking, well, we can do that. And he went, oh, by the way, there's going to be no sound. We're going to do this to music. And great testament to him. He kind of trusted us to do it, and went away, and, you know, with the help of Chris and particularly Max, we didn't just use kind of a fluid sim. We then here are animated, and I'm sure Max and Chris can elaborate on this, the individual parts of the blood. But before we talk about the blood, I'd like to say that the bulk of those shots have been recreated because we had to push in and there was a rotating camera throughout the entire sequence. So before we even got to start on the blood, we'd spent 6 to 8 months creating most of those shots, and, you know, a good third of those shots are fully CG. before we even put the blood in. And then when it came to animating the blood, I think Max did a great job. He wasn't just animating fingertips on keypads, he was animating blobs, and we all gave them names. You know, it'd be like third blob to the left. They didn't have glamorous names, but you know, we gave them names and we gave them character. And Max, you can probably elaborate.
It was highly choreographed, wasn't it? I mean, it was,
yeah,
that was the thing about it, was the music and the kind of making it all work across the cut, and this shooting methodology of replacing the background to allow us to control the dutching of the camera, because there would have been no way of choreographing that to the degree we did if we tried to get it, you know, in camera.
Yeah, there was one shot. My favorite shot in the scene actually is a shot that they shot all the actors on wires, and they all did the best they could, but they just felt, you could feel that they were on wires. They were sort of bouncing and kneeling down, and so we reanimated the shot, and it was quite a hero shot of Felicity's character, but we'd had anima for that, so we were able to do a fully digital shot, and it fit seamlessly into the sequence, and really sold the 0G.
Got a final question regarding the sick Earth. I'd just like to know the conversations that you had of how you thought the Earth would look, because it's quite chilling.
Matt, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I should start. I mean, so essentially, this was the white elephant in the room, and George had always said, this film isn't a disaster movie. This isn't a film about a man escaping death because the climate is collapsing. What is happening is unimportant. But having said that, it's important to an extent that you have to portray it. So we were stuck with this kind of, and I love a disaster movie. I love post-apocalyptic. You know, I'd have zombies kind of crawling out of craters, left, right, and centre if I could. But this was one of the few examples of a scenario where we had to kind of sell that the Earth was dying, but make it the least important aspect of the story. I mean, this is a story about a man traveling to save his daughter, not escaping the Earth's demise. And I feel we actually succeeded, which is kind of complete, kind of roundabout brief that we normally have to a post-apocalyptic scenario. But I kind of loved it, and within the restrictions, I think, you know, and we had a fantastic art director at Framestore, Jonathan, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, Uffenhuffen. Everybody mispronounces his name, but you know, he came up with the look, and I mean, he came up with quite a lot of the looks on this film, full stop. But he did us proud.
I think it was constructive ambiguity, wasn't it? It was purposefully not one specific cause of the apocalypse, and allowing that to be ambiguous.
That's great. Thank you, David, Chris, Matt, and Max, and we'll speak to you in a short while. We're going to move on now to Mulan, and I would like to welcome visual effects supervisors Sean Foden and Anders Langlens, who are nominated alongside Steve Ingram and Seth Mowry. Hello, both.
Hi. How are you guys?
Right, the sheer scale of the undertaking of Mulan, you know, this whole world alone is impressive. How long were you involved on the project?
I personally was on the job for almost 3 years. It was a long time for a live action film, but it's only because we had about a 5-month delay waiting for Fishe to be available. We kind of worked sort of part-time during that period. Disney put me on some other stuff, and but I started in July of 17, and I finished. Sorry, I started in April of 17, and I finished in March of 20. That was my thing. So it was you know, a long effort. We spent a lot of time traveling to, you know, in the early days, we went to New Zealand and China during, you know, for full scouts with all of the department heads, and brought back a lot of great information. Had a lot of time to let things marinate with Grant Major, our production designer, with Mandy Walker, our DP, with Nikki Caro, our great director. So we had a lot of time to really kind of talk about a lot of these approaches and some of the really incredible locations that we experienced out there.
And Anders, what about you?
Almost exactly a year less than Sean, I think. I think the first time we met Sean down in New Zealand was April of 2018 or thereabouts. So we had nearly 2 years on the project all told, which is a huge amount of time for a normal visual effects picture these days.
Let's start big and perhaps scale down to some of the details. But first of all, creating a whole city. From what I gather, a new system was devised in order for you to create this world, this city.
Yeah, we came up with a more procedural approach to trying to create something like this. Traditionally, if you're trying to build a city, you'll build like X number of buildings, however many you can afford to build in with resources that you have, and then start building out city blocks and distributing it around to create the overall city structure. But that's quite time consuming, quite manual work. So we developed a procedural system that essentially allowed us to create the entire city at a click of a button, based on a series of layout rules. And in order to devise those rules, we spent weeks and weeks reading up about historical sort of academic papers, mostly about looking into research into the actual layout of the real city that we were basing our imperial city on, which is Chang'an, which was the capital of the empire during the time period which Mulan is set. Specifically, we were looking at it during the Tang Dynasty. And that, it's an enormous place with like over 1 million people living there. It's like 100 square kilometers in size, so it's absolutely gigantic. But the whole thing's based on a fairly strict formal layout set up in terms of the city planning. And so that allowed us to create a system in a tool called Houdini in order to generate the entire city essentially in one go. Based on using digital elevation map data for the terrain, which we started with the actual historical location of the city, and then laying out the city in a series of districts, which is then subdivided into smaller individual sections, which are then subdivided into individual plots. And for the plots themselves, we built essentially like a construction kit of buildings, which were based on scans that we took at a location called XY Studios in Hubei province in China, which is the backlot location that's used for a lot of Chinese productions. And that gave us some good source material to start from, which we could then create essentially an almost infinite variety of buildings by stitching pieces of those scans together. And then that gave us a source material to basically spread out onto the whole city. It was a little bit more work than just pushing a button and the whole thing comes out the other end, but it gave us a starting point that allowed us to really quickly make huge sweeping changes to the overall structure. So, our first pass out at it, we looked up maps of the city layout and the water channels through it and that kind of thing. We looked at maps where locations of things like restaurants and places where people live, like high-ranking government officials. You can look at maps of that and say, well, if there's a lot of high-status individuals living in a certain area, then it's probably overall more wealthy, and so we choose to put our bigger, more ornate buildings in that area. We knew the location of things like the larger monasteries, like the Great Wild Goose and Small Wild Goose Pagoda, which are the ruins of it still there, and so we could actually place this stuff accurately within the city, run the system, and get a city out of it at the end. Which, when you do that, it looks fitting. It looks like what you'd expect it to look like, but it doesn't exactly look very cinematic, because it wasn't designed with Hollywood in mind when they built it. So we then start making big changes to it, like things like we shortened the city so it's not quite as deep, so that we could still see the Imperial Palace complex from the front gate, the south gates of the city, which is important to start establishing those locations in the audience's mind when they're watching. And we could raise areas up to make them more prominent. And then because we could essentially redistribute the buildings and have or redistribute the underlying terrain and have the buildings adapt to that, we could do things like change the path of rivers through the city in order to create breaks in between the buildings, which give it a more organic feeling and make it more visually interesting to look at, rather than just having a very regular grid structure. And then because we generated the whole thing sort of semi-automatically, and we're able to make these big changes to design the overall look of the city and iterate on it as a concept very quickly. That gave us a lot more time to still then go in and hand dress specific areas to really bring out detail where your eye's going to see it, and to tell little stories about what life was like in the city. So there's a big opening shot when we first established the city, rising up above the south gates, and we see like a marketplace area on the left with a little canal winding through it with people on boats and wandering over bridges, and market stalls and awnings and things, people going about their lives there. And then on the right hand side we've got like designed a little sort of military academy with recruits doing drills out the front of the quad. And those were kind of, Nikki was wanted to feel, this huge sort of metropolitan environment, but also have quite a militaristic feel to it as well, because that was the atmosphere we're going for with, the empire as it was. And so telling little stories like that allowed us to really start, building out the world and adding a lot more color and flavor to those scenes, so that the audience can start to get a feeling of what, life was like.
And you've got that massive scale, and then you come down to something that genuinely surprised me, that I found out that Mulan's horse was not real.
Yes. Yeah.
That's just extraordinary.
Well, yeah, Black Wind was a unique challenge that the team at ImageWorks took on, we had some shots with the stunt double riding the real horse. We did have some shots with Fishe riding the horse. She actually could ride a horse really well. So there are shots of her riding the horse for sure. But everything in the avalanche and a few other sequences, I'm trying to think of where else we put it. But I know we did, hero full screen Black Wind with her galloping on it right there in front of the camera. And those were done really, Steve Ingram's team, the special effects team, really came through big on that, because they gave us an amazing buck. They gave us this buck that really gave a convincing performance with Mulan. The animations were driven by gallop cycles that we were able to feed to their team. We had enough time that Fishe was able to sort of be comfortable on it, and it just meant that when we shot her on green screen, she believed it too. She believed she was on the horse, and so then the team at ImageWorks, led by Seth, they had some really good reference. We had the stunt double galloping on our Black Wind in a lot of good footage, both close-ups and wide shots that second unit had shot, and we were able to use that as what I like to call the Pepsi challenge. So we animated our digital horse galloping right next to that horse, and actually Image Engine did digital horses as well for the Roarin' attack on the Desert Garrison, and we employed a similar technique, but those horses didn't have to be quite as hero. So the Black Wind, that came under a lot of scrutiny and really passed with flying colors. I know that they created new tools for hair grooming and dynamics and things like that to really and muscle systems to get it to be as convincing as it was. But in the end, I was surprised at how good it looked in even some of the early versions. I was like, holy crap, we have something special here. And I'll be on sets or whatever since then, and people are showing me this, saying, well, can you do a horse as good as this? I'm like, well, yeah, we worked on that one. I'm like, oh, okay. Then people see that, and it's I was really excited about how that turned out.
And Sean, I've heard you speak online about favorite shots in the film. I was just wondering if you could talk about one of the ones that you've spoken about so poetically, the shot of a hawk flying down with the city with the beautiful light in the background.
Yeah, I think Anders and his team at Weta just did a tremendous job of building this city. And it must be said that yes, we tried shooting. We were in the XY studios. We tried shooting some drone footage to try to give us a feel, a flavor, a reference of what this was. But if you look at the drone footage of, again, what's this sort of small backlot version of Chang'an versus what these guys were able to put together, one was a way overly hazed out polluted, thing that had, lots of apartments and buildings in the background and looked nothing like, our beautiful city. And one was a convincing, beautiful sunrise moment where we start on the hawk. We have this really incredible hawk that the team at Weta also did that matches a production live action hawk that we had for some of the, some of the simpler things that we were able to shoot a real hawk for. Of course, anything that needed specific performance was a Weta shot where they would create convincing, really beautiful animation of this hawk. But we start with the hawk, and then we reveal the city slowly, and just the lighting is gorgeous, and it really shows off the depth of detail and just care and artisanship that these guys really put into this stuff. And it is worth saying that although the team did so much to create this city, if you watch the movie, there's not that many shots that we had a chance to really sort of show off all this stuff. So every shot kind of had to tell its own unique story, not unlike, the Avalanche, same thing. We didn't have a lot of cuts to sort of tell these stories. So when we showed Chang'an and the Imperial City, we really had to make it count. And whether that was a fully CG shot, like they did a lot of those, or we had maybe a partial set like that was, we would put the entire palace into, which Anders should speak about that. But yeah, so that shot was definitely one of my favorites. It just had a lot of elegance to it. We didn't overdo it with the camera move. It was simple. It felt like something that could be shot, and maybe that's where our drone footage came in handy to just kind of give us something that was something real to kind of base our world on. If that makes sense.
And Anders, what about you? Do you have a key moment, a magic moment that you're proud of with the film?
Well, there's certainly that shot. Yeah, that was. I just really love the lighting on that. It's a classic Wellington sky that's doing the work for the lighting there. Nice. I think the other main one was the witch transformation. The first one of those that we see, where we see the soldier come down the stairs from that fully digital palace that we built, and then you see the soldier transform from soldier to the witch, and then the witch transforms into the hawk in one sort of long, very balletic shot, and that was very challenging because Nikki wanted to do it more as a sleight of hand trick than anything else. So it's not, traditionally when you're doing a big visual effects picture, if something needs to transform, it'll often be a big flashy thing with lots of glowing fairy dust everywhere and lots of places to hide. But in this, we're extreme close up, and she wanted it to be very understated and very, very subtle. So everything had to work, really. We spent a lot of time trying to combine the different plates that we shot for the soldier and the witch, who was played by Yashi, Mulan stunt double in this one, on location in China, which we chose to do for the natural light, which obviously made it a lot more difficult than shooting it under controlled conditions on green screen somewhere. But the end result was a lot better for that. But so we had these sort of uncontrolled, or as controlled as best we could, given the location plates that we had to try and combine into one smooth movement. And then essentially we had fully digital versions of each of those characters that we blended into and out of in order to create one smooth transformation moment. So the witch and the soldier are actually fully digital for a huge chunk of that shot. And we're just seeing individual pieces transform, like individual parts of the costume start to transform one into the other, and CG sleeve dropping into frame that we use as a wipe, and then that blends back to like practical costume afterwards. So it's really, it's also a very long shot, which of course makes things very difficult as well when you do something like that. But that was I think the longest running shot that we had on the show. That went for over a year, that we were sort of fiddling with that and noodling with it to try and get it to work, because it's just a question of being very careful and very deliberate. It was worth it, I think. It was worth it. It's just a question of being very deliberate about how you put that stuff together and making sure that at every stage that everything's flowing well, because we really wanted it to be a very graceful moment. That was a word that Nikki kept using, and so it was just a question of building it up piece by piece, and then just adding in enough CG where we needed to blend things from one into the other, and I think I felt like it just came out really well. I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, and I would say, Ian, that shot kind of embodies sort of the theme of the visual effects in Mulan. It was really about, yes, there was magic, yes, there was a lot of epic type of shots, but it was really Nikki's vision of that was to keep it restrained and to keep it sort of as photographic as possible, and that's why we had a lot more of the sort of sleight of hand approach to things and less of the sort of expositional type of effects, and which is a real challenge for all of us, because we're used to, a lot of us have worked on commercials, we've worked on the bigger explosive types of movies, which we all know and love, but this was definitely not one of those. This was about sort of using VFX in a little more of a kind of restrained yet still expansive kind of role, and so that shot just sort of, to me, represents all of that. That was the one that really kind of shows where we landed on the movie.
Thank you, Anders and Sean. And again, we'll come back to you in a short while. Our fourth nominated film is the one and only Ivan. And I'd like to welcome visual effects supervisor Nick Davis and Ben Jones, animation director Greg Fishe, who are nominated alongside animation supervisor Santiago Coloma Martinez. Hello all.
Hi there.
Hey. Thanks for joining us.
Very nice.
Right, I want to start first of all with movement. It's the first thing that struck me with the film, just the way that each of the creature moves. Not in the way that I feel that I'd seen in a lot of films before, the attention to detail. Could you talk about the way that you looked at the movement for the animals?
Absolutely, yeah. We looked at a lot of animals. It was a lot of study, a lot of trips to the zoo, a lot of actor footage, and a hell of a lot of animator footage. We recorded ourselves acting out the performances, especially for Ivan, as well as the kind of the study, going to the zoos, looking at all the wildlife documentaries. We trawled through hours and hours and hours of footage, to try and find the right balance, because this is, as you probably know, it's quite an intimate movie. We're quite restricted in our environment. They've got nowhere to go. So we always knew that this was going to be our biggest challenge, was we were going to be so close to them. So there's no hiding, if you like. There's no smoke and mirrors. There's no big action scenes. There's no big explosions or anything like that. So our intimacy was our biggest challenge in a way. So the study of the animal was crucial, but a lot of the time, it's very subtle. So that performance and that subtlety came out through a lot of kind of footage that we kind of animated ourselves and shot ourselves of ourselves, as well as wildlife. Looking at a lot of dogs. I've got a dog, and I looked at him more than I've looked at anyone in my life recently. So that was our fun bit.
Let's actually stay with Bob, the dog. He, more than any other character in a way, exemplified the decision that seems to have been made not to overly anthropomorphize the creatures. I'm aware that in saying that, these are creatures that still do talk, but just in their behavior, it does feel like if someone hadn't told me, I would be convinced that was a real dog.
Yeah.
Bob is a good example, I guess, to talk about.
Yeah. I mean,
Nick, you want to go?
Yeah. I'll just jump in there for a second, because I think that was a sort of a fundamental part of the approach to the movie right from the very beginning. Was, the animals had to be completely photorealistic. Bob had to look like a dog, and obviously he was a huge challenge, because something as humans that we're all conditioned to look at, we see all around us all the time, are dogs. Yet we knew that our dog had to also be able to emote, and not just emote, he had to have humor and pathos, and he had to have passion, and he had to have verve, and he had to be Danny DeVito. So he had to be funny, and he was whimsical, and he embodied all of these spirits. Yet at the same time, we didn't want to break him. And it's a very, very delicate path that we had to tread. We worked long and hard with the director, Thea Sharrock, and with the studio about, where everybody felt that line went. And we obviously as visual effects people, we wanted to go down that very photorealistic route, but If you go there too far, then it becomes boring. Yes, great, he looks like a dog the whole time. But if you push it too far, and if you over anthropomorphize him, suddenly you are in the uncanny valley, and suddenly then there's something odd, there's something broken, and dogs don't really do that. So I think that Greg and his team really had to make a lot of very delicate decisions on a shot-by-shot basis, and they were discussed from the top of the studio down to all the way through MPC of where is that sweet spot, where does the movie where is it still carried by the performance of the animals, yet we don't break that photo reality that we were searching for.
And it was never a thing that was there's the right balance for every shot. It was a thing that kind of changed shot by shot and scene by scene, and to keep it as real as possible, like Nick was saying, balancing that act with Danny and his performance, and getting that right, but keeping it subtle enough that it didn't break it. Just peppering in throughout the whole performance of Bob and every character the nuances of the real animal. So you're always kind of reassuring the audience that these animals are real, but they're talking. So hopefully by the end of it, what you're seeing on screen, you're forgetting that you're looking at talking animals, and you're with the performer, you're swept up in the emotion of the story, which was pivotal. Which of the animals was the toughest challenge? All of them, for different reasons. I would probably say Bob the dog was the toughest, purely because we knew what Danny brought to it and how much of a challenge that is and how delicate that is, like Nick said, to get that balance right, to not go too far, not go too realistic, and enough that he's the light relief and the comedy relief in a certain way against Ivan's soul, so it's the relationship of the two of them that was pivotal, because they are long-lived friends, and it's to get that yin and yang balance between the two of them. So Bob, in answer to your question, was our toughest, just because it was a delicate balance to get it right and not to push it too far, and not to be too subtle with the whole thing, when balanced against Ivan.
I'm sure, though, that Ben will agree with me, and I'll let him sort of talk about this, was that that we had a lot of challenges with Ivan on more technical basis, where we had to have Ivan interacting with water, interacting with paints, and finger painting on glass. Was a huge technical challenge that we had to overcome. I mean, Ben, why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he's the star of the show, isn't he? And I think the guys, really, well, we really started by just getting reference of, gorillas from all over the world, and kind of choosing what our hero Ivan would be, which ended up being a gorilla called Zawadi in Animal Kingdom, I believe, and we sort of based him on that, and then came up with a appealing design for him that's both photoreal but also has leading man qualities, and the guys just went to town on the kind of eyes, which are obviously super critical to just hold the audience. There's shots in the movie that are long just on his face as he's talking with other animals. There's no action necessarily to speak of. It's all about that emotion. So that was a major focus for us. Yeah.
And again, like all these films, it is about the detail. One of the things I find really touching towards the end of the film is when Ivan enters his new home. It's just that shot, the close-up we see of his hand reaching out and just gently touching the grass, and just seeing the slightest movement is incredibly impressive. I want to ask about the real and virtual sets in order to have human beings interact with these CG characters.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the movie split itself almost sort of perfectly into two halves. We had one half of the movie where we had live action actors, we had sets, and then obviously the actors had to interact with CG animals, and we used puppets and and a lot of the more traditional tricks and effects to give them, eye lines and to give them things to interact with. But the other half of the movie, which was often in the same environments, was just completely CG. So we early on made a decision that we wouldn't go and try and shoot plates, and we didn't know where the depth of field was going to be. We didn't know what the animal was actually really going to be doing, and it just didn't really seem like the right approach to the movie. So we decided to go down a sort of a virtual photography pipeline, which basically meant, first of all, we had to actually build those environments and make them not only completely photorealistic, but actually match precisely to the most tiny, most nuances about every surface had to sort of match the real surface, because often we were cutting from virtual environments to the practical environments. So there was a lot of detail that went into the sort of creation of those environments. But then, of course, we actually then had to create this whole pipeline of how we wanted to shoot the virtual side of the movie, which involved doing motion capture, which involved Greg's animation team, basically creating master clips of entire scenes, and then we put those into the virtual engine, and we took those onto a virtual stage, where we were able to then reintroduce our camera crew, our DP, and our director, and basically allow them to shoot the virtual scenes as they would a real movie. We had their camera crew, we had dollies and cranes and steady cams and handheld cameras, and we had the same filming crew that we had on the practical side, now on a virtual stage, and able to actually shoot the movie in exactly the same way that they shot the live action half of the movie.
And so, taking all this into account, I've asked about the toughest challenge in terms of what the characters, but the toughest sequence that you guys had to face. What was the biggest challenge for you? Greg, let's
Nick,
go with you.
Want to go?
Yeah, Greg, let's.
I don't know. I think the crossing of the road at an early stage was probably a tough sequence. Where they crossed the road, which we called the Abbey Road scene, just because we didn't quite know how it was going to work. We didn't know what we were going to do at the beginning and how we were going to stage it all together, and then going through the forest. But it wasn't the toughest scene in the end. I think it was just the birth of it was we had a scratchy heads, Nick, for a little bit about what we were going to do for that scene. But technically, I'll let the other guys answer. What was the toughest scene to pull through to the finish?
Ben and Nick.
Well, I'm going to jump in with the painting scene. Ivan in his little balcony area with the curtains closed, doing his big painting, and I think it was just. It wasn't the hardest by like a mile. It was like the whole show was kind of quite level quite hard, but that one was interesting because it had to be abstract, but at the same time you kind of got an idea of what's going on and how do we light it, because he's basically in a dark tiny little room. So that one was definitely a big challenge for us, and also creating these shots that still were very cinematic, with him and the paint and looking through the paint at his face and things like that. So that was a hard one for me.
Getting light in his eyes, Ben and Nick, right? That was one of our challenges. Is a dark-skinned gorilla in a dark place and getting enough light in those eyes to kind of tell the story, because that was kind of pivotal, right? I mean, I guess my first discussion with Thea was the story needs to be told through Ivan's eyes. If an air of silence is as strong as a spoken word kind of thing. That if you can tell that story through Ivan's eyes, then you kind of pretty much a long way there. And so in a dark room with a dark-skinned gorilla was a challenge, right?
Mm.
And we did always make sure to be thinking about those CG characters, with the light and, in the sort of live action sets, Nick, we had the Ivan's head, a practical head that we could kind of light for, because yeah, you're right, is with a gorilla's skin in that dark environment, you kind of need to know what it will look like and have the lighting to sort of support it, to make it blend in.
That's great. Thank you, Greg, Ben, and Nick. And again, we'll come back to you shortly. Finally, we have Tenet, and I'd like to welcome Special Effects Supervisor Scott Fisher and Visual Effects Supervisors Andrew Jackson and Andrew Lockley. Hello, all.
Hi.
Great, thanks for joining us.
Hello.
So we have a world that moves in two directions at once through time. And I have not, some people have mentioned previs already, but watching the film for a third time the other day, it struck me that previs, perhaps more than some other films, must have played an absolutely essential role in ensuring you knew which character was moving in which direction, in which time frame. Could you talk a little bit about this and what a challenge that was?
I better jump in on that one. I think early on, I did the scene in the film where there's forwards and backwards cars, there's forwards and backwards people transferring from one car to another, cases being thrown. And we see that scene forward from forward's point of view, and the second time from inverted point of view. So I blocked that out in my head as a sort of previous, not to previous shots specifically, but more just to work out how those all reacted with each other. And it turned out that that tool of being able to scrub forwards and backwards in time from the forwards point of view, and then look at it all again from the backwards point of view, and that both stories made logical sense in both directions for each of the characters. And it seemed like there wasn't really any other way that we could do that. And it became immediately obvious that that was going to be incredibly valuable for those scenes and where the forwards and the backwards interacted. So we kind of, we actually brought, got somebody, Bodie Clare, another DNEG person over to America where we were doing pre-production, to help out with that. And it turned out that he happened to have an amazing capacity to work, to hold the forwards and the backwards world. And he kind of became the go-to person for that while we were on set shooting those scenes. It's a very, very valuable tool.
Scott, it does actually look like you're about to show us the car sequence where you sat for this discussion. People have talked a lot. Sorry.
No, just kidding.
People have talked a lot. Reviewers and journalists talk a lot about Chris Nolan's kind of preference to have actual physical effects that are bolstered by visual effects. Can you talk about the discussion that you had with Christopher on this film?
Yeah, it's always a little bit different. You have to kind of break down films with him different than a normal film, because nowadays as you read through a script, it's hard to tell what might be. You make the assumption a lot of stuff's probably going to be visual effects or heavily CG. But with him, you take a totally different approach, as everything's going to be practical until you hear different. It'll be a different, there'll be a practical version of it. And on this show, especially because there's so many different ways to film each scene, being forward and reverse, knowing that we had other, not necessarily visual effects, but something that he'd be willing to do, which would be, reversing the camera and doing things kind of a little more trickery, so we knew we were in for pretty much every scene in the movie.
And both Andrews, can you talk about your involvement in the discussion? Do you all sit down together and say, okay, what can we actually do physically, and at what point do you come in, or are these separate conversations?
We all. Oh, you go, Andy.
Well, I was going to say, I went over to LA to read the script, and it was all highly top secret. I had to read it and pretend not to take notes, but did. And I had to sort of come back to London and sit down and with Dan Neil and try and come up with a breakdown of what we thought the work would be. And our list was far longer than what was actually ended up in the film. There was a lot of work in there that we never dreamt we'd be able to be doing in camera, but did end up being in camera.
Andrew.
I mean, we always, with sort of group of people in a room looking at the script and all of the various things that are going to be required. And Scott said, we know that ultimately Chris will push to shoot as many things practically as we possibly can. So we kind of start looking at shots with that in mind, like what can we do for real? And the like the plane crash is a really good example, isn't it? Because ordinarily you would never imagine that a real plane, you look at that scene in a script and you'd assume that some part of that is going to be either a miniature or a CG plane, or at least some major part of that sequence is going to need some fairly major visual effects. But it turned out that because we had a whole lot of shots leading up to that, we really needed a real plane to shoot that in. And so we were kind of already in that world where we needed a plane that you could drag around on a runway, and then sort of a logical next step to say, well, why don't we just sort of build a set there and crash it into it? And so those are the sort of conversations that we have leading up in pre-production, I guess, leading up to the shoot.
There's another sequence that I was quite curious about in terms of the line between the actual physical and the computer generated effect coming in, which is the hydrofoil sequence. Could you guys talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I mean, that was boats, and a lot of them were actually when we had actors on them, we towed them and without sails, and there was a few shots where we had sea sails, so that because they're really like Formula One racing cars, they're not you couldn't really sail them around with actors on, but yeah, it's again largely in camera with some of the CG sails, and we did do some face replacements on some of those shots, and also a lot of correcting the crew. We had the crew in the wrong places. The actual crew need to be taken out and the real ones left in, or whatever we did there. So yeah, a little bit of that.
The stand-in for Elizabeth was a rather chunky man, wasn't it? And we kind of thought that we were probably going to have to do more replacement work on him than we ended up doing, and we built a very good digit of Elizabeth to replace it, but ended up being able to do most of it by disguising the man, doing some careful paint work on these rather chunky arms to make him feel a little bit more Elizabeth-like. So yeah, so minimal intervention to disguise rather than replace.
And then, no matter all the incredible set pieces that take place in 2/3 of the film, we finally come to this battle sequence that like I said, I've seen this film 3 times now, and I still find it mind-boggling to not to work out what's going on, but to actually figure out how on earth all this was choreographed, with the explosions, the falling buildings, the buildings falling back. Could you talk us through each of your roles in creating this lengthy battle scene? Perhaps Scott, we'll start with you.
Again, like Andrew said, it was the previs was key for everyone to work with the stunt department and our departments to try to make sure that roadmap, the route that these characters were going to take, from point A to B, and then what was happening along the way, and then reverse engineer it to what we had to do the opposite direction, and always choosing the most difficult parts to do. What we couldn't act or perform in reverse, then those would be things like obviously some of the pyro and things that had to go in a forward direction we would do. But there were some mixed in there. We did some ratcheting stuff and some air mortar things that were in reverse that played in reverse as well. So
just quickly, all the explosions going forward were actual. They were real, and yes. The explosions in reverse were a mixture of both.
Were a mixture of CG and then ones that were filmed in reverse.
Right, thank you.
And some are neither forwards or backwards. Some are reverse entropy, so that they start off like a forwards explosion, but then because they're inverted ammunition, entropy pushes back. So we have this sort of 70-40 split where it goes out and then everything starts to suck back in. So obviously they have to be digital. But there's quite a few of those as well.
Begins to explode. Right. Andrew Jackson, yes.
Just to say that, in all of the scenes, in terms of the choreography, we'd have to credit George Cottle and his stunt department for learning and like training themselves to perform in reverse, because really the vast majority of shots where there are arming forwards armies and backwards armies, they're doing that for real. And as Scott said, the more difficult things you would do forwards, and then the easier ones to do backwards, we would do it that way, and sometimes reverse the whole shot. So, you know, the backwards became the forwards and vice versa. But for the explosions in the end scene, there was, you know, a lot of shots with forwards and backwards explosions, and we had practical explosions and then CG ones that we needed to add in the opposite direction, which had to match exactly. So that was quite a lot of work in there as well. Not to mention the building that loads and explodes.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew, Scott, and Andrew. I'm going to open the floor now to audience questions, and a couple have already come in. This is to all of you. What advice would you share with young people starting their creative careers and hoping to specialize in special visual effects? Does anyone want to start? Or
I've got a very short answer, which is to look at reference and copy it. That's kind of the key to everything we do, I think.
But also just to give it a go. Like, don't think that it's a career that you can't get into. Like, give it a shot. You know, talented people are quite short to get hold of these days, so it's easier to think to get into than you might think it is. But give it a go. If you want to do it, give it a shot.
Yeah, I would like to kind of reiterate what Andrew said, and it's people can hate me for this, but you don't need to go to university. I mean, just try it, start, work at the bottom.
Yeah, and the truth is there's so many different options out there that, you know, if you say, hey, I want to get into special effects or visual effects, there are, you know, 1,000 different things you could be good at. And really, once you get in, you'll start seeing what your friends are working on, and you go, oh, maybe I'll go that path. And eventually you'll find exactly what you want to do.
I think it's with the where we are today, it's not a bad thing to start on set. You know, I hate the data wrangling and up, because a lot of our generation now don't get to see a lot of what goes on set and follow through. So if you can be lucky enough to be mentored by a supervisor, you know, if you get that would be the luckiest thing in the world, to just be able to work on set, follow through as a young kid and learn the older guys' generation of how we go through our process. Is, I think it needs to still be taught. You know, I'd hate to think that what we do gets lost now in, you know, pockets. You know, it's the mentoring, I think, is important.
I've got a question here from Gianfranco. How many rounds of VFX iterations do you have to do on average in a film before the director is happy with the result? Let's go to, well, actually stay with the Greyhound team.
Four. Well, you know, Greyhound, we didn't have the flexibility of being able to do 2 versions, unfortunately. So we were left to our own devices to kind of have to let go. Normally, obviously, it all depends on the director. I hate to say it. The director will deplete how many versions we go through, but Greyhound situation, we had to say 4 or 5 versions, and that was it. Move on. That was just for that particular show. That's kind of my answer to that.
I'd say, I mean, I'm a fervent believer in the fact that you can, as we did in Greyhound, you promote certain shots within sequences to push them forward in order to try to say, wring out the creative genius of the filmmakers, that they have no other way to go. And that philosophy kind of works across whatever film you're trying to make, from the kind of the Marvel films all the way through to the historical war films. And I think that once they've established that and they've gone through all the different iterations of ideas that they've had in their head, then you go, well, that's it. And then that particular shot might have 150 versions, but every shot that looks similar to that, or is in the similar sequence, or is a shot, you know, akin to it, may only have a few versions. And that's a very wise way I've always found to work, instead of going at every shot as an individual shot and creating 100 different versions, because that is, for me, a hugely time-consuming way of doing things and not particularly a savvy way of doing it. So I think what Greyhound did was take that and kind of had to basically just distill it down because of the time constraints.
Depending on the type of work, you know, creating a master shot, you know, in the beginning of our process, depending on the type of film you're working on, is, you know, having your hair on fire in the beginning of a show rather than the end, I think is a is a great way of working.
What about Team Mulan? Is that question?
Yeah, similar to what Pete was saying, I think, and what Nathan was saying, it's like we would, you know, even though we had a long schedule, our post schedule was probably about, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 months, really, like from the time we really were working. And we had a lot of tentpole shots, you know, tentpoles being the shots that were the main big shots that would hold up the avalanche sequence or the battle sequence. Yeah, Nikki was fairly new to visual effects, but we spent a lot of time explaining the details on how things would work and giving her, you know, options so that she would feel comfortable to kind of like, you know, be able to dial in something. And yeah, we definitely did a lot of versions, especially in the beginning, but when she became comfortable and she really felt that we had embraced the vision, then she was more comfortable, you know, accepting the next shots that came in line with that sequence. It didn't feel like we were trying to just rush a bunch of shots through and go approve, approve, approve. So I think on average, we probably did 10 versions of every shot that we actually, you know, 10 legitimate comps, but there were some, not unlike the one that Anders was talking about. We probably did, you know, 70 versions of that shot. I don't think we presented 70, but we probably did 70, you know, maybe more. I don't know.
And what about Team Ivan?
Yeah, we sort of had a similar approach. We had a sort of a 6-point sort of structure to our animation shots, and then we'd get to the end of that, and then hopefully that would get us to the end of it. But then often we would noodle and we'd change our mind and we'd start again. And you know, I think that's a sort of you know, every movie is different, every director is different, and obviously you do find shots that push you to the limit, and you have to do 20, 30 iterations, and you chase your tail. But we did try to go for a very sort of structured process on our show.
We also did a lot of rehearsals as well. You know, so we went through, before we kind of shot anything, a lot of kind of experimentation and finding the right take, if you like, or the right balance of the performance before we shot anything.
I'm aware we're pushing time. I've got 2 questions here. So I want to move to Team Tenet and Team Midnight Sky with this question from Adam Morling. Could you please talk about your collaboration with your production designer and cinematographer in terms of how you use color and light and add texture to your work? Perhaps Midnight Sky first.
You're mute, Matt. Matt, you're mute.
I apologise. So I'd like to start. Jim Bissell is an absolute hero. You know, he worked on all these films from E.T. to Kentucky Fried Movie. And he was the one that kind of said to us, you know, I like to embrace new technology. And he had this idea for this Arctic viewing station that was highly reflective and had these huge aspect windows. And in my mind, that was just alarm bells were ringing, because, you know, you put a DP in a room with massive windows, but it's the Arctic outside. He's going to expose for inside, which means the outside is blown out, or he could expose for outside, in which case the inside is dark. And I was left with this quandary because, you know, I didn't want to be left with these shots looking compy. And Jim had designed this beautiful set. I mean, apart from a set in space. And the stagecraft, the LED, was the best case scenario, because we had a very tight schedule when it came to post shots. And let's get these in camera, you know, we thought. And Jim just loved the idea. In fact, he embraced it so much that he actually designed a lot of the set using the virtual camera and using the NCAM system to kind of walk around a virtual stage. And, you know, we realized the set didn't need to have to be raised so much. So Jim and I kind of had daily conversations with, you know, along with obviously George and Martin, our director and DP, but everything was built as a collaboration, even down to our spaceship, our ether. I mean, you know, we did everything with him in mind, and I'm a firm believer in visual effects. Because we cross all boundaries, we tread on everybody's toes, and that's costume, that's DP, that's director, that's production design. So we have to collaborate, because otherwise we're just a pain in the arse.
They were a very, very collaborative bunch as well. All of the heads of department on Midnight Sky really did embrace us and
tolerated us.
Got involved, and it was great to see George walking around with an iPad, you know, scouting and a virtual set that was never going to be built, and kind of engaging with a previous process that was ultimately going to, you know, get us out of Dodge when we came to shooting difficult stunt work. So it was all very circular in that sense, in a good way. People always talk about collaborations, and I think they're sort of speaking through gritted teeth and thinking they really hated each other, but it wasn't actually like that.
Jim was very easy to work with, very easy to work. The whole art department, well, like you said, the whole team was very collaborative. There was no sour eggs, you know.
And let's move on to Team Tenet.
I guess I would, my sort of strongest collaboration with the art department is more about you know, negotiating what's going to get built and what's going to be visual effects, and you know, we did work with Nathan on you know, building the miniature buildings. Obviously, there were a major component that had to be built, as we actually built third scale miniatures. But that's like a real collaboration between the art department, SFX, and VFX. So the art department had to build the things, SFX had to blow them up, and we had to put them all together. And that was a lot of interaction between all three departments, as well as building larger full-size pieces that needed to move in that. And it was a sort of very strong collaboration between practical art department pieces and SFX pieces as well.
I do have one last question here. It's a general industry question about moving towards greater inclusion and diversity. And so I'll offer it out to everyone. What excites you about the industry's future?
I think the most exciting thing is just the democratization of the tool set that you have nowadays. Like, you know, I think when a lot of us first started, you know, the machines cost like 20, 40 grand, something like that. And it was a very specialized thing. But nowadays, you can find, you know, equivalent software to what we use for doing, you know, AAA work for free, you know, in like open source things. And it's incredible to see what people are able to do just with their phones now, you know, like the TikTok craze for doing these little edits like you would have seen in a high-end commercial even a few years ago. I think that's the most exciting thing, that everything's sort of open to everybody now. So the next generation of filmmakers and, you know, visual effects professionals are kind of have all of this stuff at their disposal, and they can explore their creativity in a lot more free and easy way than I think it was available to a lot of us when we first started.
So we're moving away from a narrower channel into something much, much wider.
Exactly, it's there for everybody to pick up if they want to. All the need is an idea, and the tools are just there on your phone almost.
Although, can I just step in there for an answer to that question myself as well? I actually think that you only have to look at this group of people on this to say we're not very diverse. In fact, we're incredibly undiverse, embarrassingly so, I would say. And I think our industry needs to do an awful lot more. And I think visual effects needs to, and I think it needs to come from the houses, from the studios. I think we need to get a lot more women, and we need to get a lot more racial diversification. So I think we are falling down in that regard.
I think
I agree. And one thing I'd say, Ian, is I think we should, you know, as studio level supervisors, we should encourage the vendors that are working on the shows to send their comp soups, send their CG soups, send those. And COVID makes it tough right now, but we should really try to have some programs, because I think there's a lot of women for sure in a lot of those roles that I know can do this job. And it's just like, it's getting that, I think what Nathan was saying, that on-set experience, which is so hard to get, and getting some of that mentorship going where we're again, COVID makes it tough right now, but I think when things are a little better and we can welcome more of our vendor teams to set, they will get more of that experience. And then hopefully we'll be able to see more of that diversity, more of, you know, getting more women into here, frankly. And so it's going to happen, but it needs to.
But I think that's right. It really is just allowing people like us to open the door and welcome people in and mentor and just involve. I bet, you know, it's what we need to do.
I think that's a very good point to actually draw this to a close. Thank you to all our guests this evening, and congratulations to each of you on your nomination. A very big thanks to our session supporters, Adobe. And the next event in this series features the supporting actor nominees, which takes place tomorrow at the earlier time of 6 p.m. And if you haven't signed up for that, you can go onto it by going to BAFTA.org. Thank you very much again to all of you for joining us this evening, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Thank you, BAFTA. Thanks.
Thank you.